I'm going to tackle the Christmas plates, the Danish Christmas plates, because I do this once a year, and it's a sort of spring cleaning thing, and they do gather a lot of dust because we've got a fire in here. And this is a collection that I have partly inherited and partly collected myself, because I really love the Danish Christmas plates. And these are made by Bing and Grøndahl, and Bing and Grøndahl was taken over by Royal Copenhagen, China at some point, and they're still making these plates annually, but they started in about 1890s. I'd have to look it up, late 1880s or early 1890s, and they were so successful. They only made a very small number, but they were so successful that Bing and Grøndahl continued to make them every year. And my parents loved them, and my grandmother loved them, and gave us, all three girls, one of them for a few years until they got more expensive and my grandmother couldn't afford it anymore. And also I have some old ones from my mother's real father, who and I think his wife gave us some of them. Anyway, I'll just start cleaning them. Running a sink of hot water to wash each one individually, and then I'll get them down in groups of about 3 or 4 from the wall, and then I'll have to wash off the smoky soot mark that's happened behind them, because they're in a room with a fireplace. This is a little bit tricky. In fact, the TV's moved since last time. I have to move the television a little bit. And I've got to do them in order, because I like the order that they're hanging in, for various reasons. The colour palette is a bit different. So some of them are a bit dark, and some of them, as you'll see down there, are a bit light, and I like alternating a little bit. And then while they're down off the wall, I'll have to clean the wall. That means cobwebs and soot. First, second, third, fourth, I think. So this is a beautiful design of one of the walking street, I think. Oh no, it's not the walking street, because it's got cars in it. Anyway, it's the centre of Copenhagen and Christmas decorations, and it's 1956. So that was the year I was born, an auspicious year. So that's why I've got that one. I think it was Mum and Dad's collection. So Mum had them hanging in her dining room at Point Lonsdale, and the walls were all blue and light blue, was it? I think with contrasting panels, sort of Edwardian style house inside, and there were blue panels with timber around the panels, and these looked beautiful all around in a sort of a frieze around the dining room. The significance of this for me is that it reminds me of the farm. So my grandfather had a farm in Jutland, and for the years that we lived in England, from 1961 to 1966, we went to Denmark frequently for school holidays and often for Christmas. And this actually reminds me of the farmhouse and the hayloft opposite. So they were built around a quadrangle, often the typical Danish farmhouses, and up above the pig stable at my grandfather's farm there was a hayloft, and we children used to climb up the ladder into the hayloft. You had to, I think, even climb into a pig pen. I don't know, the ladder was up anyway, and we climbed up into the hayloft, and we had there was lots of hay, obviously, and there was a cat, and it had a litter of kittens, and we had one each. There was salt and pepper and vinegar and mustard. Actually, there were 4 kittens. I think mine was pepper, can't remember. But anyway, there was also a little window that looked down over the courtyard of the farm. So this is a little Christmas nizemand, as they're called in Denmark, like a little Father Christmas's helper, Santa's helper, and the farmer's wife may have been putting a rice pudding or something down for St. Hans or St. Nicholas, it would have been, to have Christmas dinner. I don't know about the significance of that, but anyway, the little nizemand and the cat are looking down in the courtyard. So I love that. That's one of my favourites because it reminds me of that hayloft at the farm. My happiest childhood memories were at the farm in Denmark. My mother's collection, I think, and it's the Town Hall Square in Copenhagen, and there's always a beautiful Christmas tree. On Christmas Eve, the snow, it just brings back the atmosphere in Copenhagen. That's the Town Hall, I think, there. 1930, I think my mother would have got this from her real father's sister, Tante Olga. She had some, but I'm not completely sure. And this one I love because it reminds me of my mother. It even looks like my mother. And she always had the children and the grandchildren in the next generation. She often had them sitting on her knee playing carols and playing all sorts of piano music, actually. But at Christmas, we all danced around the Christmas tree, and we still do. And
it's a Danish tradition.
And it is a Danish tradition, and Mum used to accompany us on the piano. Sometimes she'd stop and join in. That even looks a bit like my father there. That's a beautiful... We didn't actually have live candles on our tree. Because obviously it was an old-fashioned custom and it did cause some fires. So we had beautiful electric lights which Dad and Mum got when they were first married, so they were from the 50s. I've actually still got some of them, little bulbs, multicoloured bulbs that we put on the tree. But that's my mother as far as I'm concerned, your grandmother.
Yeah, crimson rosellas on the bird bar.
Hang on, say that again.
Stinking hot day for November. We've had such a dry, hot spring, it's ridiculous. There's no water anywhere. My favourite. Very old too, 1923. I think this was in the corner.
Uh-huh.
This is a little Stone Age burial mound, and there are many dotted around Denmark. But this is, well, it reminds me of the one on Langeland, which was just near my aunt's home in later years. She lived on the little island of Torsinge, and Langeland was just nearby. And that was a very well-defined, still well-defined Stone Age mound, burial mound. Most of all of the Stone Age mounds have been plundered in Denmark over the years, including one that was on our my grandmother's and grandfather's farm. There was actually, it wasn't like a stone mound, or whatever that's called, I can't remember, but it was just a mound, obviously a burial mound. And my grandmother was fascinated by archaeology, as was my mother, and so she got the idea that she would like to excavate the mound, which they're all, you know, under the National Trust equivalent in Denmark, and you're not allowed to defile them in any way. But anyway, she got my mother and us as small children with our spades and our shovels to defy the law, and off we marched up the paddock to the burial mound, and we started to dig. So for several days in succession we dug and we dug and we dug to try and get into the burial mound, and she was a bit nervous that my grandfather would find out because he wasn't into breaking the law in that way. So she was quite nervous, and I think he did get very angry when he found out, and we stopped. And needless to say, we didn't find anything because we were probably the last in a long line of plunderers that had dug up the Stone Age mound. Metlin-borg. Once again, this is an old one, and this was actually given to me. I think it was given to me by my mother's aunt, Tante Olga. So that's her real father's sister. And this is a Metlin-borg castle. So this is the residence of the royal family in Copenhagen. And I think that's the marble church in the background, Marmorkirken, and the guards, the royal guards. So this is quite an old plate from 1936. So what I've done is I've restricted my collection to 15 because I don't want to go berserk and have them around every room, all around the roof line, because I think they lose effect. So if I get a new one, because you can get them on eBay and they're not that expensive, I swap it with one that's one of my least favourites, and I would give that away or try and sell it on Marketplace, but nobody seems to want to buy them. So what I've thought of more recently, is having a few representatives from each decade in the history of the Danish royal the Grøndahl Christmas plates, porcelain Christmas plates, and having some from each decade, just a couple of representatives from each decade. I've actually got a book in the bookcase with all the plates up to the 1980s, I think, and they're depicted with a bit of a story behind them, and I love that book too. That's on my bookcase in the back room.
I don't know.
Probably my favourite, absolute favourite, because it's very old. Firstly, 1923. It was designed by so the different designers who designed for Grøndahl lasted a few years each, generally speaking, and they all had their own style. So you can see that there's a lot of difference between that style and that.
Is it?
Or one of the modern ones. Yes, this one is quite intricate in its style. That's in the 30s. This one is very simple from the 20s. This one is, it's I suppose a more detailed landscape, but it also has sort of thicker lines to it, so it has a certain characteristic. This one is just so simple. Just that little castle. That's the Royal Hunting Lodge in the Deer Park, which is on the outskirts of Copenhagen. A beautiful, beautiful park. Very, very big, actually. And it's forested, and there are herds of deer. There are even white deer, beautiful deer. But it used to be the King's Royal Hunting Park. And this was his little hunting castle where he stayed. Or it would have been he. And there's a story about this Royal Hunting Park, Dyrhaven, it's called, the Deer Park, because my mother learnt to ride. There's quite a sort of an exclusive riding school used to use the grounds of the hunting park. And my mother used to tell the story of one day she was riding along and her horse bolted, and she lost all control of it, and it galloped right up to the wall of the little hunting lodge and stopped, and she fell off. So that was Mum's story about Dyrhaven. But she also used to go there with her friend Bender. They used to catch the tram, I think it was a tram. And they used to be able to go up to the Dyrhaven and with their toboggans when it was snowing. And there's sort of undulations, they called them hills. They're not really big hills. But it was enough to have fun on your toboggan, and she talked about doing that too. And I loved Dyrhaven and the changing seasons. It's a very beautiful area if you ever go to Copenhagen. This is Kronborg Castle, so Hamlet's castle, and this is from the 1950s. Kronborg, yeah, it is Kronborg, yeah. So even these days they put performances of Hamlet on somewhere around here. Actually, I can't remember, but I think it supposedly took place on this platform up here where Hamlet meets his father's ghost. But I've actually been to a performance of Hamlet here with my dear friend Bodil, and this is where it takes place. So it's Helsingør, but I think in the Helsingør, but in Hamlet's play it's called Elsinore. Very beautiful castle, with of course the typical copper roofs. It's the Dutch Renaissance style, I think, and there are many copper decorative roofs like towers in Copenhagen as well. But this is up on the northeast coast of Zealand, which is the major island of Denmark. Same person as that last one, which was, I think, the deer one was in 1923. Actually, on the subject of the deer one, Mum knew that I loved that. She had that one in her collection, but she knew I loved it. And when she went to Denmark on one of her trips with Dad, they bought that plate for me because she knew I loved hers in her collection. That's the other one I'm talking about, not this one. Because you can pick them up in Denmark. You can pick them up in antique shops or flea markets even. Very cheap if you're lucky. You get one. Some of the ones that are more common aren't worth much, particularly the later ones like the 70s and the 80s, but some of the older ones are getting to be worth a little bit more, but still quite affordable if you stumble across them. Yes, and so that meant that her one in her collection went to Jessie, or I can't remember who. But this one I found on eBay. So it was the same designer, equally simple, and I think I have to remember what that design is, what that building is. It's a Danish sculptor, and I've just forgotten his name, but it's his museum in Copenhagen, and the beautiful pigeons. This is from the 70s. Just a very typical, probably a little bit cliched view of the beautiful Danish church and swans, white swans. But by this stage they were writing on the back what they were. So this says Landsby Jul, which means Christmas in the village. I actually knew that without looking at the English. Here's another village scene. So this one says, Til jul I præstegården. Til jul, that means Christmas at the vicarage, or the parsonage, or whatever you want to call it. Arrival of Christmas guests, it says in English, which isn't quite the same. So, you close enough?
Yeah.
So this is an old image, obviously. The farm is actually, it's very typical still of farms, more historic farms in Denmark, in the countryside, with the timber work and the 3 wings to the building. Sometimes there was a 4th, but the sleigh obviously dates it. But our farm in Jutland was not, it wasn't that really old style with the timber work. I don't know when it was built, maybe 50s or something. But the stables actually were quite old, but they didn't have the timber work on them unless it had been painted over. And they weren't joined onto the building like this was. But that's I just think it's a beautiful old image. It's sort of evocative of Hans Christian Andersen. Some of Hans Christian Andersen's themes were used on the plates. I don't think this was one. In the 60s, and it was in church on Christmas Eve, and that for me evokes memories of going to church in Copenhagen, so in the suburb of Hellerup, where my grandparents lived and my mother grew up. Everything happened at the Hellerup Kirke, so baptisms, weddings and funerals often happened there, I mean relevant to our family. But in Denmark there's often a model of a church, a sailing ship hanging in the middle of the church, and it had some sort of symbolism attached to it. Not quite sure what, but my father always used to love that symbol. And we'd walk from Mum's house where she grew up in Frederikevej number 17. We'd walk up the street and to the right up the Strandvejen, which was the main road along the, sort of along the beach. I mean, in from the beach. But to the church. So we'd walk there on Christmas Eve for the midnight service, and I think it was the midnight service. It may not have been, may have been an earlier one, but I think it probably was because we had the Christmas Eve celebration. We had dinner on Christmas Eve, and you know, Santa Claus came, Father Christmas, and we had all the presents and we danced around the tree, and I think we probably went to church either late in the afternoon or later that night. May have been late in the afternoon, but it was already dark because of the cold, dark winters in Denmark. Grungy wall.
Say that again?
The grungy wall.
Oh yeah, very grungy.
Because we have got a fireplace in here, and it does cause a bit of ash and dirt. Actually, the whole room needs repainting. Rolling.
Yeah.
Actually, I might put the Christmas tree down here. 1930, 1971, and 1956. I'm a bit torn about the Sanger. So I belong to a meditation group that meets once a month, and it's affiliated with the Plum Village tradition and the Plum Village based monastery that we have in near Daylesford. It's called a place called Porcupine Ridge. And Plum Village, in case you don't know, is the monastery in the south of France, or the centre, that was developed by Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a wonderful Buddhist teacher from Vietnam, who actually was had to escape Vietnam. He was banished from Vietnam, I think, during the Vietnamese War, and he established this centre in the south of France. Anyway, there's a monastery affiliated with that centre in the Daylesford area, and I belong to a Sanger once a month, and they're coming here at the beginning of December. Usually we meet in Ballarat, but beginning of December they're coming here. So this is part of the process of just getting ready, but also getting ready for Christmas. So I'm just wondering whether to continue to offer to have the Sanger here in the early December or early November, when the roses will be at their best. But then if I had it in early November, which means the garden would be more beautiful, the spring cleaning that takes place wouldn't be as beneficial for getting ready for Christmas. So I'm a little bit torn about that. Plates?
Next 3 plates.
Next 3 plates, please, Pete.
Next 3 plates here.
Next, please.
Next. Towel.
Thank you. I know that the marks aren't coming off completely, but they are going to be obscured by the plates.
Why you hold the camera too?
Yes, you do. So, what are we going to have now? I think maybe this one. See, the other problem is with having, if I don't get them in the same order, that I've actually hung them to be even. So some of the loops at the back, because the hooks weren't exactly in the right place, it might alter the height. You see, it is altering the height. Bother. I'm going to have to check this on the video.
I'm still rolling.
Alright. Roll away.
I'm rolling.
Yeah, moving right along. 2, 3, 4. It'd be good if I fell off, wouldn't it? Oh, it's not wet to paint. Painting anyway. Product now. I just want to talk to you about 3 plates that I hadn't covered. So I think that's 1977, I can't actually see. But can you zoom in on it, Pete? You see, this is oh yeah, very good. This is a picture from the centre of Copenhagen with the round tower in the background. That was a very famous tower that people can walk up. It's like got a circular ramp inside that goes up to the top. The story was that Christian IV, who was one of the famous Danish kings, I can't really remember, but I'm guessing from the 1600s, actually built it so that he could drive his carriage up. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, because I don't really know where he would have turned it around to come down again. But anyway, it's a beautiful old tower, and one can walk up there and see a lovely view of Copenhagen. And in the foreground, there's a little window that opens up, and there's another little Christmas elf, another little Nisemad there opening the window, and that he's looking at the Christmas tree, isn't he, in the other house opposite. But that little attic window is exactly like the attic windows that used to be at my grandmother's big house in Hellerup. So the house in Hellerup, we had the farm in Jutland, but then the family home was actually in Hellerup, which is I think it's a northern suburb of Copenhagen on the sea. And Frederiksvej, where the house is, it's like a sort of a villa. And at the bottom of the street is the sea. And, you know, Mum talks a lot about that beach and the harbour, the little harbour that there is, and a playground a bit behind the house. You can sort of wind around a couple of alleys and it takes you down to a little harbour. She talks about having played down at the end of the street, down below the stone wall on the beach where there's some big rocks, and a German soldier coming up and looking over that wall during the war. And she was very scared because everyone was scared of the Germans when they occupied Copenhagen during the war. I can't quite remember the story. She's written it in a book, but he's very friendly, and he says and he gave her his hand to jump up on the rocks and then jump over the wall, and then he walked her back up Frederiksvej to her home. So she would have, I don't know how old she would have been, 6 or 7. But anyway, that villa was on Frederiksvej, and it had 3 stories. The ground story where my grandmother lived and my grandfather, and where we stayed. The second story where my aunt Jette lived, and with her young husband and children eventually. And the third story was the attic, where actually Mum and her sister and brother, I think they had bedrooms there when they were little. And I remember staying in that attic room upstairs at some point, and we opened the windows and looked down into the garden. And Mum's story was when she lived up there as a child, she opened that window one day, and her father was in the garden, and she called out to him and said, "Hello, hi Dad." And the pane of glass fell out of that little attic window down into the garden, and her father was very cross because it was quite dangerous. It was a long way down. But that little attic window is exactly the same iron frame and the little rod that held it open. So when I look at that, firstly I loved Copenhagen, the centre of Copenhagen and the round tower, but those little attic rooms, as well as the little Danish Nisemad, it's very evocative for me. And the next picture is a special church. It was a round design of church that developed, I think, on Bornholm, the island of Bornholm, which is
get this shot again of this one.
Oh yeah. The island of Bornholm it belongs to Denmark, but it's south of Sweden, so it's quite a long way, and it's quite a long boat trip to get over there. And I went there in 1977 when I took a year off during my university year, and I spent a long time, 3 months I think, with my grandmother in Denmark, at least 3 months. But I took a trip to Bornholm by myself and stayed in youth hostels, and I saw that round church. It was built It's a medieval church, and it was built as a fortification. That's the church of Rønne. Rønne is the little town, the main town, I think, in Bornholm. R-U, O with a line through it, double N-E. I think I'm right anyway, but that's the church at Rønne, without having to look it up. But you can see how it was built as a fort, in actual fact, where people could take refuge. So, once again, very evocative for me. And then the Christmas decorations. The Danes typically made their Christmas decorations, and those hearts are still made by, for example, at the Swedish church, when they have Danish Christmas tree decoration making, or actually now probably more often at the Danish club, Denmark House in the centre of Copenhagen. And you cut the heart shape at the top, and then four long pieces like this, cut them, and then the other one, and then you interweave them like that, and you make the hearts. And children used to do that in Copenhagen. In Denmark, that was a tradition. So it just reminds me of our Danish Christmas trees that we've had all these years and still have. And that's the end of that. Lots of relics from Denmark and other places. Scotland, for example, Malta. You good girl? Good girl, Rosie. You're a good girl.